Hi, my name's Jim Williams. I worked at WKY for 32 years. I started back in October of 1958. So I had a fairly long tenure. I might say that it was an enjoyable tenure for the whole time. Most of the days were very good days for me, and I enjoyed my work. And I certainly did have a good time doing the weather on Channel 4. It became some other names later on, which we'll discuss as we go through this. Let me tell you a little bit about my background and how I happened to get the job. It's a little bit interesting, at least it is to me. I hope it's interesting to you too. Back in the 50s, I worked for the Air Force. I taught meteorology at a pilot training school in Arizona. They were contract schools that were operated by civilians, of which I was one, but they were paid by the government to perform this service. And I was a meteorology instructor for the Air Force training program in the early half of the 50s, well actually from 52 to 57. So I had a pretty good tenure there back during the Korean conflict. Now the way I got my job, I have a close friend that I went to school with. We double dated, and we had a lot of relationships in between, but we used to, from Tucson, where we actually lived, we'd drive back every Christmas to Oklahoma City. And the reason for that was all of the vacations for everybody on that base, 2-week vacation trip, always occurred during the Christmas holidays. They closed the base down, so we all got off at the same time. But anyway, we would go back to Oklahoma City and visit these close friends of ours. And at one time while we had a visit, he said, Jim, he worked for the Oklahoma Publishing Company. He said, Jim, we had an opportunity to hire a new meteorologist at Channel 4, WKY, and I didn't know how to get a hold of you. I thought you might be interested in a job like that. Well, I said, yeah, that would be a nice job I'd like to consider. At the time, I was working in the Air Force, teaching. He couldn't find me after I left there. I went to New York for a while, and then to Denver, and I was doing forecasting for the airlines there. And he finally caught up with me at Denver and said, Jim, we do have an opening, and this opening is available immediately. And if you're interested, why, you contact such and such a person at Channel 4, and you make arrangements to fly in and do an audition. Well, I set that all up. Well, let me tell you what I did. I left Tucson by airplane, flew into Oklahoma City, made an appointment to have an audition, and this was back in 1958, before videotape. And I might say, in my opinion, I was so bad in that audition, if they didn't have audio tape, if it had audio tape, I would never have gotten the job. But since anybody that wanted to audition had to show up personally, it was more of a problem for the station to get people to come and for people to actually afford to come, because you'd come from long distances. But anyway, I did audition, and I did get the job. And the job consisted of doing air work, as most of you would know. Now let me tell you a little bit of how that happened. The very beginning of television, back in the 40s, when I was still in college, I was in the military reserve, and once a month I would go to Tinker Field and perform services at the weather station there, weather facility, for one weekend. I do that every month, and I did this for a couple of years. Well, in the meantime, I met some very, very important people, to me anyway. One of them, his name was Wally Canaan. He was a forecaster at Tinker. He was doing research, and there were two other gentlemen there, named Colonel Fawbush and Captain Miller. And they were doing research on tornado activity, and the reason for that was they had 2 tornadoes that hit Tinker Field within a very close period of time, and the government decided it was time to try to do something about it. So they started a research program which involved doing a lot of graph work and preparation for analysis and that sort of thing. I wasn't doing forecasting at that time, I was still in college, but I did go to the Tinker and did some plotting, which is the manual process of the atmosphere distribution of what's going on. You know, you've seen all these cases where they send balloons up to measure different things in the atmosphere. Well, we take that information and plot it on the graph, and that's what I did. Plotted that information on the graph on weekends. It was rather boring, but I was surrounded by some pretty smart, influential people. So I really liked doing it. Anyway, I got to know Wally Canaan a little bit, and sooner or later, Wally Canaan went to work at Channel 4. WKY was called then. It was also Channel 4. And they'd been doing this tornado research, and Wally was involved in that. He was up to date on the technology, and he had an opportunity to do some research for a particular situation which he thought was very threatening. And at the time, this was back in the late 40s now, it's 47 or 48, I'm not sure which. Those late 40s, there was a rule in the Air Force, or not the Air Force, but the government, that the Weather Service or anybody else was not allowed to broadcast tornado forecast information. Maybe warnings, but not forecast information. They call it a tornado forecast back in those days. Now they call it a watch, which is the same thing. Well, anyway, Wally Canaan saw this situation, and he had started working part-time at the same time at Channel 4. And he was on duty, and he went on and said,
"Good evening, everyone. I'm Wally Canaan, WKY-TV staff meteorologist, and there on the board I've drawn our graphic representation of a tornado funnel, one of the most dreaded phenomenon, and indeed one of the most severe in all of weather."
I've been doing research with these people at Tinker. We've learned quite a bit about forecasting the possibility of tornado activity or extremely severe weather. And this evening looks like this is a prime opportunity for that to happen. Well, lo and behold, it did happen. And he issued a tornado warning for the area. It was the first tornado warning ever issued anywhere in the world on broadcast media. It was against the rules to do that, but he did it anyway. Well, after the word got out, the public wrote hundreds of letters, or maybe thousands, I don't know, there was a lot of them, and they sent these to Washington. And they saw the letters, and then they changed the rules, so they say, okay, we have enough information now that we can actually issue a forecast of possible tornado activity. So at that time, it all changed. So that's what's happened since then, made it possible for the forecasters to do this. So they have done that on a regular basis, as most of you know now. Well, Wally became a full-time employee at Channel 4 and was doing the regular weather, as we mentioned. And he was doing a great job, I suppose. I wasn't here at the time. I lived somewhere else. But anyway, Wally had an associate that came from Tulsa. He was hired, so there were two people at the station that did weather work. That's the way it was for a long, long time. Harry Vogtman, that's the name, is Harry Vogtman. Got him from Tulsa. I used to watch Harry Vogtman when I lived in Bartlesville back in the early 50s. And the television I watched, I didn't have a television. No, very few people did, but I was living in Bartlesville working for Phillips Petroleum at the time. And I was not married. I was engaged to be married, but I wasn't married, so I lived in this home with these people. We had a room, and I would just watch their television. I used to watch Harry. He was from Tulsa. We picked up the Tulsa station. Anyway, that's the way I got to know Harry a little bit better on television. I didn't know him personally at that time. Well, he was hired by Channel 4, so he and Wally were together there at the same time. And then Harry Vogtman, not Harry, Wally Canaan. Wally Canaan left. I even went to Cleveland or possibly Pittsburgh. I'm not sure exactly where he went, somewhere back east to be on television. And he took the job, and left an opening. And Harry Vogtman became #1 there. And then they hired a fellow from Tulsa whose name was Bob Thomas. You're probably all familiar with his name. He was on the air for several years there. So they hired Bob Thomas. Well, after that, not too far down the road, Harry Vogtman decided he wanted to go to a different station, so he went to Channel 9. So it was left an opening. Well, that's when I was asked to come in and do an audition. So there was Bob Thomas there by himself doing the whole thing, just one person trying to cover all the bases in the weather department. Pretty tough. Anyway, that's when I came for the audition, which I think was, I was terrible, but nevertheless I got the job. I appreciate that. But I went to work, as I said, back in October of 1958. Now my training consisted of about 3 weeks of practice, learning how to do television, learning how to work with the cameras, the camera people, and the signals, and all the different hand signals they would give you back in those days. And Joe Jerkins, who was program director at that time, was my mentor, really. He taught me just about everything I learned on how to do and how to act in front of a camera, which is somewhat different, I might add, than teaching. Teaching is a little bit more formal, I would say. I began to find out that television is a very informal medium. And they always said, now Jim, you talk to 1 or 2 people out there, not an audience. 1 or 2 people, that's the number of people that are in the home watching television. Just think of that when you go on the air. And that did me more good to perform much better than I would have ever been able to perform without that advice. After I practiced for 3 weeks, I said, boy, I've got this down, I'm ready to do it. Anyway, it's Monday morning in November. It's either the 18th or 19th of November. Not a stormy day normally. You do get storms, of course, any time of year, but this was not forecast to be a stormy day. Now, after the fact, I went back and looked at the meteorological things that I should have looked at earlier. I was just learning, really. And there was a cold front up in southern Kansas. It had been stalled there for about 12, 18 hours, and they were forecasting it to move back north. And when that happens, all the warm, moist air goes with it up into Kansas. There was no problem, so fine. Forecast as we wanted it. I went on the air, and just in the middle of the show, we had all heck break loose. This front came barreling through, and we had severe thunderstorms on my first minute on the air. It was pretty frightening. I was very intimidated by all this. But anyway, I got through it. Went in back into the weather office, and the first telephone call I got on my job was from a lady in Moore. She said, Jim, I just saw you on television, and I want to tell you, I appreciate your work, but you didn't give us any warning. I said, well, I didn't know we needed one. She says, well, my garage just blew away. Is it going to storm? And I said, lady, I think it already has stormed. But anyway, that was my first phone call. Well, good old Bob Thomas, who had some experience there, he showed up and helped me through the day. So I got through that first day on the air, but it was very emotional for me. I learned a lot by going through that, but we just proceeded for the next several years, improving. I think I got to be a pretty good weatherman, air personality. And I always thought of myself as just a person out there like anybody else, just talking to individuals, and that helped me along quite a bit. Now, what we did at the station, we felt very responsible to do the right thing at the right time. Sometimes it's very difficult to do that. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But the station wanted us to be up in front with everything, be honest about everything. If you don't know, say I don't know, and be honest about it. And Mr. Gaylord, he owned the station for years. He was a more or less of a weather buff, I guess you could say. He liked the weather, he kept track of it, and I don't know how much he watched me or if he ever did, but I'm sure he did. But anyway, he would allow us to do things that other stations weren't doing. As a matter of fact, when I was at Channel 4, there was only one other station on the air in the market, and that was Channel 9. So that was a main competition. Now up at Enid was another station, KOCO, which was Channel 5, but it was out of the market really, so we didn't worry too much about it. But we knew that station was going to be down in Oklahoma City before long. We had to prepare for it. So one of the things they did to prepare for this change, the management knew that the people that they hired at Channel 4, this is before Channel 9 came, when they hired at Channel 4, had a name, and the name they used was just a name. It was not a copyrighted name. So they discovered that when these other stations come in, they're going to come over here and raid our market and steal our people. And we've been advertising for years to get these people known on the air. So what we're going to do from here on out, we're going to give these people a stage name. And they did that for several people. And I guess it worked out pretty good because they kept those names for years. And when they mentioned the name, I'd have to stop and think what the real name really was. But anyway, they did that for quite a while, and they don't do that anymore. But it did kind of solve the problem because they copyrighted the names, and they couldn't go to another station and use that name because Channel 4 owned it. They couldn't use that name. Unless that happened to be their real name, but anyway, it wasn't. But that's kind of an interesting fact that most people would have no way of knowing, but that's kind of behind the scenes situation. Other things behind the scene was how we put together a weather show. Well, we had a lot of fun putting together things, and one thing I was kind of surprised about, I was pretty naive. I was just 29 when I went to work at the station. that may seem old for a person starting out at work, but I had other jobs before that, but on television, 29, I was just barely mature. But we had some different things we had to learn to do. And one of the things we had to learn to do was on our own, because the people at the station didn't know really what we were supposed to do. They knew we were supposed to present the weather, the forecast, and the people out there were supposed to love it. And we tried to do everything we could to make that happen. It didn't always happen, but that was our goal. And the station really didn't know what we were supposed to do. So we were on our own. Now, we did have some guidelines from other places around the country, but we never got to see them. You know, we weren't living there, and I didn't travel much, and there was no such thing as videotape back in those days. And the way they would transfer a program from point A to point B is what they call a kinescope, which is a picture taken with the camera off of a television set. And the quality is pretty poor, but they didn't do much of that for just making us available to see what's going on in other markets, because we weren't in management. But anyway, we did learn a lot by hearsay here and there and people talking to us and all that. We took all that in consideration. Now let me tell you a little bit about the weather set. It was kind of unique. I didn't design it, I inherited it when I came to work there. It was a cube, about 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet, maybe 4 feet 4 inches, I don't know, but right in that dimension. It was a cube, and in the middle of the cube there was a pipe that ran through it, and it was on a wheel that the pipe rotated around, or an axle, like a wheel on an axle. And this whole cube would rotate. We could go forward or backwards. And we had maps on each face of that cube, which is the 4 maps. The maps were Formica. They were, I believe, green. The background was green, and all the color was black. Now this was back in the days of black and white, so the color didn't matter as far as the color is concerned, but it was a pleasant color to look at in black and white rather than black or white. So it was a big contrast. So they used the green with the black background. But I think we had a couple of maps, 2 maps of Oklahoma, and a national map, and then a regional map. The regional map was kind of a close-up showing up to Nebraska down through maybe to Brownsville and over to Mississippi and west to Arizona. A regional map, so we could get things down to a little smaller scale than the whole country. So we used those maps. The way we did it was the maps were they were painted on the Formica. And the guy that was the head of the art department, named of Doyle Glazier, what he did, he invented something that he had a copyright of that or whatever, patented it. He'd about have been a multi-millionaire by now. He designed a dispenser that would dispense the fluid via a wick out of a bottle. The bottle we used was an Elmer's glue bottle. It was about 4 ounces or whatever. It wasn't a big bottle. You could hold it in your hand. And what we did was we made wicks out of felt. We had a cap that would go on there with a little point on it. We cut the cap down to the right size and the filter down the right size that we used, the writing material, and we would use a show card water-based paint that was just off-white, just kind of gray. And we go down to Triangle A&E, a little commercial here, Triangle A&E, and pick that stuff up, buy it by the quart. And we maybe get half a dozen quarts and just store it in our storage area. We had enough liquid to get us through the whole year or longer. We each had one of those little bottles. It was all, nobody messed with it, because each one was personal in the sense that you get used to the feel of it and how you squeeze it and how much liquid comes out. And you had to do it so that you could put it on there without it running down the board, because you were doing this live. You couldn't go back and wipe it up and start over. We only had live television back then. So we had these little wicks. And the parallel I'm trying to draw here with the invention of this, and what happened later, all these little wicks that are on the felt tip that you write with work exactly the same way, except they use an ink instead of show card paint. But they all work the same way. Very simple. Anyway, we'd use that thing for years and years and years. Finally, we'll get into some other things here, but finally we disposed of the cube after we got into computers. And after we got into computers and some other things, why, everything changed. And what it changed to was for better, for good. The technology that I followed is almost unbelievable. We started out with teletype machines, which give you local information and national information. We had a machine called a facsimile machine that printed maps. These maps came from primarily Washington, D.C. area, or Suitland, Maryland, one of those regions that the National Weather Service is located. We get the maps already printed out. They came via wire, telephone line, I suppose, but we got it, and we got these maps printed. And this is what we used for years and years and years. It didn't seem like it was ever going to change. Well, it eventually did, but it required quite a bit of, not technology on my part, but on the part of the engineers. There's a fellow by the name of Lester Tucker that used to come in there every week, maybe it's more often than that, and take that machine down and clean it. And you had wires in there that you had to clean and change. It was a pretty complicated machine mechanically. Anyway, that's how we got our maps, and it was very important that we got those. We didn't have the maps, we wouldn't know where to start. If we didn't have the maps, we would have to take the teletype information, temperature, dew point, relative humidity, clouds, winds, all of that information, and plot it on a map for each station in the country, and then draw all those lines on it we used to put on our map that were already drawn for us by the National Weather Service. And since you only have one person on duty at a time, it was almost impossible for us to put together a show and prepare all the data we have to analyze to put together a show. So that was a pretty important piece of equipment. But Lester Tucker, he kept that machine running beautifully. We had no major problems with it. Occasionally it would jam up, but not very often, but that goes back a ways. Other equipment that we had, I mentioned the teletype machines. We had 3 of those. That's where we get our forecast information printed to us from the National Weather Service and other sources. And then we had a radar. It was a converted airborne type radar, Collins radar. It had about I think a 10-inch circular scope, and it was designed for aircraft use. But of course, after the war, a lot of that stuff became available, or they continued to make it, and individuals were buying it. You could afford to buy those back in those days. And that we had a radar. We thought that was wonderful. Well, on that radar, it was very good for looking at close-up information. But the information way out on the edge of the scope, we said, well, if we see it, it's severe. That was pretty much the pattern. If you see it as severe, we couldn't analyze anything on it. We just see where they were. Not much analysis to be done. But we did have a pickup. We had a camera set up on a called a scan converter, set up on a scan converter, which takes the television's, takes a radar scan and makes a picture out of it on television. And what we would do is shoot that picture and microwave it from the Weather Service, which is at Norman. It used to be at Will Rogers, but it's at Norman now. At Will Rogers at the time I was there. And they would send it back via telephone line or whatever kind of microwave, whatever system they were using at the time, send it back to us. And that's how we got the information on the radar. It was live radar. It wasn't something that we had to go pick up and bring home. It was already there. It was just sent. So we used that. It was a much better system. The radar that they had was, well, it was called a WSR-57. I'll tell you that only because it tells you the date it was made, 1957. But it's a good radar. They used it for years and years and years. It's so much better than what we had. So we could analyze that and use the other one to show on the air and for display purposes. So that was a nice piece of equipment to have. We mentioned the radar systems we had. Well, finally, there was a company, well, several companies actually, 2 that I don't know of, but there were more, I'm sure, that started manufacturing radars for broadcast use. And they made them available. They were pretty expensive, but not like the type the National Weather Service was buying and having made. So we could afford to have one. And so I might add that the fact that we were owned by a company that had basically unlimited funds, they would buy whatever they thought we needed. If we could convince them we needed it, they'd buy it if they thought it would help our program. And they did that all the time. Well, anyway, we went to looked at a couple of radars in different places. We went down to Dallas-Fort Worth and looked at the WFA radar they had. And we went to a couple other spots. And finally, we went to a new company in Alabama, Dalton, Alabama. near there. But the company was called Enterprise Radar, which was actually manufactured in Enterprise, Alabama, which is near Dothan, Alabama, which is right along the coast. Well, Enterprise they had developed this radar, and they were in the process of marketing it. And an engineer from Channel 4, who's probably one of the most knowledgeable engineers about radar of anybody on the planet back in 1958, 9 or 60 or whenever it was, 65 maybe. He knew all about radars. He was in World War II, an engineer unbelievable, and he knew everything about radars at the moment as to the technology. So we went to Enterprise and went to the company and walked the door, and we were in this big building by ourselves with the owner of the company. Neil Braswell was his name. He owned the company. And he was an engineer, electrical engineer, electronic engineer. And Willard was the type of guy that you look at him and think, well, this guy, you know, he's either a genius or a dumbbell. You wouldn't put him in the way he looked. He was a nice guy, he was smart, and he was no dumbbell, believe me. He was a genius. Anyway, he talked to Neil Braswell for about 30 minutes, and Neil Braswell was telling him how the radar was designed and stuff. Well, Willard was asking some pretty pointed questions, and Braswell was trying to field these questions. So in about 10 minutes or so, Willard says, Neil, he says, I need to use the restroom. Where's your facilities? So he took off and went wherever it was. And Neil Braswell looked at me and said, Jim, who is this guy? I said, well, he's an engineer from my station, WKY Channel 4. He said, he knows more about my business than I do. I said, well, he probably does, because he was teaching radar back in World War II and it was top secret. And he's kept up with it, so he knows everything there is to know about what you're doing. And sure enough, he did. Well, they became very close friends. We did buy that radar, incidentally. Serial number 1. Now that impressed a lot of people, but I don't think I ever told anybody on the air we had serial number 1, because I didn't think that meant too much, except the first copy, and sometimes the prototypes aren't as good as the second one. But anyway, we had the very first one, and the system has progressed over and over and over down the line, while television started doing color. So he wanted to manufacture a color radar. Well, guess who Neil Braswell called every day on the phone and talked to? Willard Hines. So Willard Hines and Neil Braswell designed this colored radar. Basically, that's how that worked. Of course, Willard didn't take any credit for it because he's working on Channel 4, but he was helping Neil Braswell out. And they became really good friends, and it progressed from there. But we did finally get another radar. We went to Lubbock, Texas, and looked at the latest radar that they'd come out with. They'd had it now about 3 or 4 years, or maybe a little longer. We got that in 1970, the second radar, which is a full-blown National Weather Service style radar. It was quite expensive, very expensive. Most stations weren't buying it because it was so expensive. But Channel 4 bought one. We set it up, and we impressed everybody so much, including the National Weather Service, with the quality and the availability of the information on that particular piece of equipment, that they sold them everywhere. Channel 9 bought one. I guess Channel 5 finally did, all over the country. So they proliferated the market with Enterprise radars, and they still are doing it now. The current one is a Doppler. They started Dopplers back in the 90s, so they're right on top of all the technology that's going on radar-wise. But in my opinion, there are about three things that make weather forecasting significant and important and available. One is the observations that you make have to be good. 2, the observation not only from just reading the temperatures and taking the soundings, which I mentioned earlier, sending the balloons up, get the cross-section of the atmospheric conditions. That was all part of it. But then radar was a big part of it. We could analyze a lot of things. Now, one thing that was of interest to me back in those days, I had no idea it was like this, but back during World War II, these ships and aircraft, they put these radars on board. They were, I guess, not very sophisticated, but they did work. And finally, one of the guys in, I don't know, in an airplane or on a ship says, this precipitation, these thunderstorms are just getting in the way, destroying our, we can't see what's going on out there. All this rain and these thunderstorms. Well, they took that information and somebody decided, you know, we need to make this a weather radar, not an aircraft radar. And that's what they did. So they have all different kinds of radar now. The weather radar was picking up precipitation before it was a weather radar because of the way they work. Anyway, those have been very sophisticated in the last few years. That's kind of a story that most people probably aren't aware of, but that's how that all started. Well, the satellites came into being, actually they sent up the rockets to put satellites up there back in the late 50s, but they were just up there going around in circles. They weren't doing much for the weather department, but anyway, later on in the 70s, they had these sophisticated systems that would go up and they would park these satellites. I say park them, but literally that's what they did. They put them over the equator. And you got to look at, visualize what a map of the Earth looks like on a globe, and put these things over the top of the equator. You would see that it's the same distance from the North Pole as the South Pole, or almost the same. And if you park them at a certain distance, they seem to be in the same place all the time. Well, relative to the Earth they are, but relative to space, of course, they're not, because they're moving through space. But these satellites are called orbiting satellites. They had different names for a lot of them, but when they got them in the one place over the equator, they synchronized it and became a permanent feature over the equator at 21,500 miles above the Earth. That's the distance that the rotation of the Earth and the centrifugal force and the gravity balance. So it was always stay in the same place. If it goes off one way or the other, then it was either speed up or slow down and get out of that orbit and die, go away, crash. So they have these in synchronous orbits. And that's where they are right now. Now, they were able to transmit via whatever method from the satellite information down to the Earth of pictures of what they're seeing. Well, we use those pictures every day on our weather show. We had a machine that printed those pictures out. They came a new picture every 30 minutes. And when we got it, it was only 30 minutes old, so we call that real time. And believe me, being able to see in real time what it looks like for your forecasting is a very, very important tool. And we were able to do that because we had the equipment, the technology. That's another thing that happened with the station that was being owned by somebody that could afford to do these things. We got a satellite recorder. And we would use it and we'd shoot it on the camera, the picture, and eventually we'd make loops out of it. In other words, take pictures of them and make a loop out of it and run a loop, which was not near as sophisticated as it is now, but pretty sophisticated. Well, satellites are one of the big things that we use in forecasting because we can see these storms in color now with the technology they were using. And then they were beginning to send them more frequently and making loops out of them. In other words, putting them together so you'd have a motion picture of actual movement. And this was just before computers came into the picture. Computers played a big part in that, and they came out in the late 70s as far as weather's concerned, as far as my department's concerned. So we've got observations that we take to get the data. We had satellites, which also enhances the information, gives visual pictures of what's going on underneath the cloud cover and so on. And we've got radar, which does a close-up in terms of the Earth, the close-up of the weather systems that are in the vicinity. And by the vicinity, I mean you pick up within 200 miles, you can pick up echoes of activity in the way of thunderstorms. As long as they have vertical motion, you can pick them up. The vertical motion, of course, you don't pick up all the storm, you just pick up the upper parts because the radar signal doesn't make much of a curve. It curves a little bit but around the Earth. But if you're looking at a storm at 100 miles at a certain elevation on the antenna for the radar, at 100 miles, you'll be looking at it at maybe the level of 6,000 feet above the ground. And if you go on out farther, maybe be looking at it at 10,000 feet. And the storms at 5,000 and 10,000 would look entirely different if you're trying to analyze a thunderstorm. So you use that in conjunction with what you can see from above with the satellite. That's all done now with computers. Now, computers, big deal. It really is. I'm not a computer guru. I have one. I'm still learning. I've had one for quite a while. But we started in 1978 in Channel 4, WKY, with an Apple computer. I think it had very, very small amount of memory. But we were producing pictures that were put together by plotting individual coordinates. If you have any idea about that, how long it would take, each bit that you see of a picture would be a coordinate. And you connect these coordinates to draw pictures. We went in and did all the maps of the whole state, all the counties on it and the whole thing, and we're using that on the air live to plot storms off of our computer. So that was a pretty upfront thing that we're learning to do, progressing into the future, and things just kind of moved right along. So everything I did at work was something new every day, and I had all the support that you could expect financially, and this from a point of view of people supporting me personally. They did that. I had wonderful bosses. I had a great job. All the support I got from everybody, thought the computers were wonderful, so that helped a lot in getting the better computers, which we did. We upgraded them. We got a computer that had a tablet with it. We could draw pictures on it. I might say that in putting together a weather show, it's very difficult to take you behind the scenes and show you what we did, because we don't have a picture to show you that. You need to be there in person. But the graphics that we made for the television, we did ourselves. We produced all of our pictures off of the computer. We would draw the maps, we would draw things on the maps, we'd colorize them, we would send them into the studio to be used on the program. And I carried with me, since things were loaded on the computer, I'd have 4 or 5 or 6 different visuals that were on a computer that I control by a garage door opener. You see these whole little things in their hand. Push that button and it changes it to the next visual. So I would send up a list of the visuals I had and what they were to the director, and whenever I pushed that button, he knew what I wanted. He wanted the next picture, so he'd punch that up. So I always had those pictures available. And one of the nice things about electronics is there's no end to what they can do. And you see on the present day the things you can do. But one thing I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about was this system of getting these visuals on the air while I was on the air. You sat in front of a board. Before, I sat in front of a board that was a cube that I had drawn maps on with a little piece of liquid, we call it liquid chalk, made with a little felt tip. I draw the maps and I'd point to them and write and do all of that. It was all live, of course. Well, with computers or other systems of getting information on, we would start with a map, a board that had nothing on it except green. We call that our green board. It's called a Chroma key, K-R-O-M-A-K-E-Y. What that does is the camera can be set for different colors, that don't show. So we could pick any color. We used blue for a while, but that didn't work too good because a lot of things in blue are on the air that you don't want to use. And anything in blue, if we had the blue chroma key, it would disappear, go to black. So we changed to green. That's what everybody uses today. The reason we changed to green are those are the least, you don't have any green suits and you don't wear any green ties. You could have a green tie, but if you did, it would disappear. So all those colors on chroma key that you see are not there. And they're not really there. They're electronically there. What we can do, I say we, the engineers in the control area would take the pictures, be 2 pictures, a chroma key, which is nothing on but a green board, and then a map, and we'd superimpose it on there. So we'd have 2 different things on that we're looking at the same time. But anyway, that would disappear, and that was kind of a magic. People come to the station and watch a live program. They was like magic to what they were seeing. Well, The way I could see what I was pointing to on a blank board, I'm pointing to a blank green board. Because I have a TV monitor on both sides of me. I turn to my right, the camera's shooting me straight on. I turn to my right, there's a profile of me, and I'm looking at a television monitor. And I can see what I'm pointing at the same time you see what I'm pointing at. And then when I want to go to the other side, I turn to the left, and they get my profile of me there, shooting me straight on. And I'm looking at a different monitor on the other side so I can see what I'm pointing at. So that's how that works. It's that simple. Nowadays, they insert the information on the lens of the camera so you don't even have to turn around to see what you're pointing at. That's an update on that, but I always had to turn. But anyway, that's how that worked, and most people are surprised today when they see something like that, but it's down to the science where there's no problems with it. You continue to have good quality pictures. It used to get real noisy sometimes, the camera wasn't acting right, but that technology is all improved to the point where that doesn't happen anymore. So when you see a picture on television, you're seeing a chroma key with a picture inserted in it. That's what you're seeing. One of the problems that we always were concerned about during severe weather was interrupting programs. People watch television to watch their programs. They don't watch television to watch weather. But we feel like weather is far most important if it threatens your life, so we interrupt programs. Well, if you're interrupting a program where there's a storm that nobody's concerned about, they don't like it. They want to interrupt you only if it's going to affect you. Well, at the time, there was no way to do that, but we solved the problem. Basically, we did it. It's Channel 4. Back in the early days when tornado warnings and tornado watches, forecasts, were in the forefront, they were pretty often in this market. You'd have some kind of a forecast or something. So they made slides for the central, a slide for the northwest, a slide for the northeast, the southeast, and southwest. 5 different slides. So if it was a tornado watch, say for the northwest part of the state, they'd stick that slide up for the northwest part of the state. Well, that was pretty inappropriate for storms that were in different areas that were on the edge of that little spot that you put up there. So we designed the method of putting the local forecasts up, warnings and things, on a map that we'd shoot with a camera. And we would not have to use a slide, and it was very accurate. So we would take this map, we'd put a piece of colored film over it, plastic, cut it out, put it up there and shoot it with the camera, and then they would show that on the camera. At all station breaks, they'd put that up there. They used to run a station break, they'd put the station ID on it, and they would put that information up there and say tornado watch, and it would show the exact area of the watch, the forecast. Not just a general area, but the exact area. That was a really plus. And then later on we said, well, that's a good thing we've done, let's progress a little farther. So I figured out a way to produce a map to show warnings. And we did that the same type of method as we use for watches, except for the warnings, they changed all the time. So we put the warnings on there, and we'd shoot the map, and they tied up a camera all the time, and they didn't like that. So the technology got to the point where we could put those on a computer, and that's what they do it today. We put this little map, it's about, it's not even a quarter, about 1/8 of the size of the TV picture. We used to put it in the lower right, and then somebody said, well, it'd be better in the upper right, and nobody ever kind of decided which was best, but right now they're using the upper right. They put this little map of Oklahoma in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, which is there all the time. Now that enables people in the engineering department to put information on that little map wherever you want them to put it. We use the chroma key. Guess what? That works good. We put it on the map. We can show the radar. We can show where the storm forecasts are, or where the storms are, or whatever we want to put on there. And also the direction of movement and the times, and anything we want to put on there, we can put on there. We call that our little marquee map. We were the first and only station in the world to ever use that. And that started back in the early 70s. And it has progressed, and everybody in the country now uses that system. Now, just look at it. The number of the people that get information without really disturbing the picture a whole lot. They can get it by just turning the TV on. They don't have to sit there and watch it for an hour to find out if there's a storm in their area. That map will be up there and it will show you where the storms are. And if you know where you live on that map, you can see it. So you limit the number of interruptions that you have to perform to show where something is, because all they have to do is turn the TV on and it's there. And of course the technology has progressed from there to using other things for that, but that's what we started doing in the 70s, and now everybody in the country is doing it. So we're pretty proud of that little idea, and it worked real well, and still working very well. Now computers now, if you watch current television, they superimpose everything on top of everything else, and you end up with some of the most gorgeous maps and complicated maps you can imagine. And you can see them, you can see what I'm talking about. And I'm sure they're all produced, not locally, but by some company that sends these maps down to them, because no way that we could go into a weather office and prepare all those maps visually and prepare the show. You just wouldn't have time to do it. So there's a full-time crew that's preparing that information, putting it on computers and sending it in. And that's basically how they get that information. And then it's transferred via television on your set. So you get all kinds of information. Animation, loops of radar, showing how the radar is moving. Where the cores are, they can zoom in, they can zoom out. There doesn't seem to be any limitation on it. And who knows where it's going next? And people ask me, Jim, if you went back on television, do you think you could handle it? And my answer is, not unless I went back to school. So I'm not planning on doing that.